Huples Cat, about to start 4 nights. But I thought I should do a public service announcement for my subscribers out there, because one of the major topics, and it's a ridiculous topic, is reopening. And I just want to talk about when and how it is safe to reopen for you. Because there's a lot of people who have got opinions on when to reopen. Various people like President Trump and Vice President Pence are looking at it from a political point of view. They're looking at getting America working again before the November election, because it's important to them to have people working than it is to actually deal with this from a scientific point of view. And if you look back at time, if you look back in the Spanish flu of 1918, 1920, and you can see that the cities that actually did social distancing and lockdown the best actually recovered from the pandemic the best. That's pretty straightforward. This is why I've been saying all along that America's very shoddy approach to lockdown is very shoddy approach to a cohesive policy. Even on masks, Trump's own cabinet disagree, some wear, some don't. Very mixed messaging. That alone is going to, in my opinion, jumpstart the rise of China above America as a superpower within a year or two post-pandemic, because they're actually functioning very effectively at dealing with the pandemic. And the more effectively you function to deal with the pandemic, history shows, the more likely you are to re-emerge from it economically strong. Of course, you could also take your cues from like this guy, who happens to be the head of Starbucks. Now, I don't know about you, but as a prepper, an emergency preparedness lifestyle individual, I decide on reopening in a pandemic based upon my knowledge that I gather from science and from data. And there's a lot of data out there that strongly suggests that reopening the United States, or most of the United States, this week or even in May, is a major error from an epidemiological point of view in terms of preventing the coronavirus spreading more than it needs to, which will result in more deaths than it needs to. In Canada, we've got a similar sort of thing going down, and we're not reopening until at least June, and that's causing a lot of people a lot of aggression. We're starting to loosen around the edges, and there's lots of plans, different provinces have different plans to loosen it around the edges so people can actually get back to work and get back to a sense of normalcy. Now, the channels that are telling you the straight information on this are telling you quite clearly there ain't no going back to February of 2020. The new normal will be different from the old normal. How exactly it's going to be different, nobody actually knows, but a lot of people are prepared to speculate and guess. I am not. What I'm focusing on here is 3 things. 1, is it safe to reopen right now? 2, if it is safe to reopen, how do you, as an individual in your family, go about safe reopening? And the more important thing is 3, what are the signs and symptoms that you're going to be looking out for to fully lock down again? Those 3 questions are absolutely important, and there is data to support what I'm going to suggest, and I will show you some of the graphs, but all the data is interpretive. Obviously, if you don't believe in COVID-19 disease exists, or if you think it's seasonal flu, you don't need to watch this video, it's just going to irritate you. If you believe that it's going to be an apocalyptic situation and the American economy is going to be dead within 3 to 4 months, again, why are you watching this video? You need to be doing other things for those 2 extremes. I personally feel America will not cease to be an entity because of the pandemic. I do think strongly that America will cease to be the global economic superpower at the end of this. I really do. And that's speculative, there's no point going into it, but I do think that. I don't think the stock market will be damaged particularly, but the stock market isn't America. The stock market is a handful of 10 billionaires and now a trillionaire who actually have control of that level of equity, and they have control of it in a global way. They don't really care about America. They certainly don't care about you. And they don't care about me. But I care about you and I care about me, so let's get into this. First point, is it safe to come out of lockdown? Now, I'm not going to trust the government, I'm not going to trust my employer, I'm not going to trust my neighbour, and I'm certainly not going to trust preppers on YouTube to tell me that it is or it is not safe to come out of lockdown. What I'm going to do is quite simple. What I'm going to do is I'm going to talk to you and show you a whole bunch of graphs and explain which graph is actually the graph in your local area, your local community you need to look at to decide when is the time to start progressively coming out of lockdown for you, not based on what other people think or other people specifically need you to do. One indicator I would not use is the daily confirmed COVID-19 death toll. If you look at your own country, or if you look at globally, if you live in Canada or America, There's a huge difference between living in rural Kentucky than there is living in New York City. A huge difference. What you need to do is you need to be looking at COVID-19 in your local area to about 100 to 200 kilometers or miles out from where you are. It's easy to see that the global death rate is dropping for your country and decide it's safe to come out, but in your own local area it's rising. But I would also point out that the actual death rate is pointless. I don't care about the death rate. The death rate is a reflection of the infection rate. Sorry, I'm struggling with the dog. Is a reflection of the death rate is a reflection of the infection rate 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 to 6 weeks prior to death. That's not really that important. When I come out of lockdown, I'm in lockdown not to become infected. If you come out of lockdown and you're going to get infected, you've come out too soon. So you want to come out of lockdown not based upon COVID-19 deaths internationally, on the continent, in the country, or even in your own state. The death rate is interesting and a reflection of the lethality of the coronavirus. It has absolutely got nothing to do, for your purposes and my purposes, about when to come out of lockdown. Now, it does show you if you're winning or losing, but it shows you if you're winning or losing based upon the past. So these are a bunch on March 1st. Of course, the data is now utterly out of date. A week is a long time in this pandemic. But you can see the steeper the curve, the more the infection was, the faster the death rate was, therefore. So you want to flatten the curve. The lower the curve for death rate and for infection, the less likely you are to have an out of control situation. But whatever, they're all heading in the bad direction. But then what about deaths per million? So that's always an interesting one, isn't it? I mean, Canada is a smaller country in population size than America. So what you should be looking at is deaths per million. But that's not to come out of lockdown. That just gives you an idea of where your country lies, how good your country's government, and it's a government's, federal government's responsibility to make sure that the states and provinces and local councils are dealing with this effectively. They're in charge. They wanted to be the boss. So you can see from this that South Korea and Canada are doing relatively okay, whereas United Kingdom, Spain, Italy and the United States relatively were doing fairly badly on April 23rd. But the curve's coming down for a lot of these countries, so you might think, well, let's open up. No, you don't want to open up based upon deaths overall or deaths per million. Your only criteria is how infectious is it in your local area today, and should I come out of lockdown today and have a very, very low risk of infection or a moderate to high risk of infection. If there's a moderate to high risk, if you can economically stay locked down. So the curve I'm looking at is infection rate, and I'm looking for the downward slope of the curve. Remember, in a pandemic, as many people die and get infected going up to the peak has come down from the peak, and also there are multiple mini peaks both on the way up and on the way down. Right? This is not straight, this is not linear, this is not A to B. This meanders all over the spot depending on infections, depending on hubs, depending even on the weather, because obviously if the weather's really bad, people aren't going to go out and they're going to stay in their homes. They're not going to go to the malls or the bars if they're open. So there's lots of factors here, but the main factor you want to look at is not the death rate. The death rate is an indication of the infection rate from weeks ago. It doesn't matter about that death rate whatsoever. What is important when you look at a graph like this is that you are seeing that the peak may have been achieved. It may have been achieved on April the 15th and is coming down globally since then. And that's wonderful news. Obviously, if there is no deaths anywhere in the world from COVID-19 disease, it's pretty safe to go out if there's no infection present. And that's one of the things China's done particularly well, is they very, very carefully looked at keeping harsh lockdown well after infection and death rate dropped to very, very minimal levels. And that's really smart with any sort of coronavirus or influenza or prion disease, anything that uses a human being as a vector to transmit the disease to other human beings. The longer you can keep human beings separate, the more likely you are to have the case fatality rate drop and the infection rate drop, and hopefully drop to the point where people aren't actually going to be infected once they start walking around again, because it has, in a very literal sense, burned itself out within that population. Now that's a problem because we live in an integrated and global planet. Well, we did. I don't think we do right now. But as things open up, I expect to see globalization resume full bore, and that will put places like China at huge risks from places like America of getting reinfection. And so a lot of the countries are going to use at least a 14-day quarantine, maybe a 21-day quarantine as information goes out there. They're going to swab once and twice. They're going to be very difficult. You're not going to hop on a plane and go to Tenerife for 2 days. Or I'm not going to hop on a plane and go to New York City for the weekend. That's going to take a lot more confidence to come back that there is no COVID-19 disease in Canada or America. There is no disease, not that it's at a low level, before that sort of happy situation occurs again. Now the reopening graph everybody's looking at is this one, and this is absolutely the last graph you want to look at. This is a graph of the industry collapse in the restaurant industry in major United States cities up to actually about the 17th of March. It's a lot worse now, and they are all reopening now. And I'm going to show you a slide that I'm going to show you again. The slide I'm going to put up now is actually a slide that shows that the cities that had the strongest lockdowns in Spanish influenza actually had the fastest regrouping of industrial capacity. In other words, the places that allowed the pandemic to run its course. Who cares about old people? Who cares about fat people with diabetes? Who cares about the few children who died from this? Nobody cares about the staff nurses or the porters. Let them all die. The economy is more important. Of course, the farce is that the economy is more important than the disease, the cure is worse than the disease, where in fact history clearly shows that a fulminant pandemic in a society actually is far, far, far worse than actually trying to control it in terms of the economic outcome. But it suits certain people to deny that obvious piece of historical knowledge. So for me, I want to see the Ontario provincial and the Canadian curves becoming right down in terms of daily new infections. I want to see them drop below 50 or below 100 before I have any confidence that I can go outside as I used to and do things that I used to do, like eat in restaurants and things like, and go to the cinema. I'm not going to go to the cinema. So I will be looking at the infection, the daily infection curve rate, and I want to see a gradual decline in that below 50 or 100, depending on how I feel, depending on where it is, over the course of a week before I even consider returning out of full lockdown. Now, of course, I am working and I occasionally have to go shopping, but I'm doing that in a very controlled environment, and I'm doing that certain times a day, and I'm doing that as safely as I possibly can. I'm in partial lockdown. So that's what you need to do. Look at the daily infection rate, wait for it to drop down below a certain level, then think about it. For example, if my infection rate is really high in the province of Ontario because Windsor is having a massive outbreak, but the Greater Toronto area has had like no cases for a week, I might start a partial reopening at that point. I wouldn't be travelling to Windsor though. Okay, so what does a partial reopening look like? For me, a partial reopening means that I might stop wearing gloves when I go shopping, but I will be wearing a mask. Eventually I might stop wearing the mask, but it really has to be very, very like almost no cases for several weeks in my community before I do that. And I also have to be fairly reassured that people aren't travelling into my community, bearing in mind the Greater Toronto area is a massive tourist hub and also a massive destination hub because we have so many people here like myself who are immigrants, that's going to take probably a global reduction before I stop wearing a mask in public, where I'm close to people and I can inhale their droplets. So that means for me, where I live, I won't be going to a restaurant. Now I want to talk about takeout versus eat in. I don't care what they're doing on the eat in, the risk of infection, if there's infection present, is very high. I also think if you're taking takeout, the risk of infection of that food is also pretty high. So again, I'm not going to be eating out or taking out for quite some time, nor will I be buying coffee. Now, I haven't been buying coffee for an awful long time because I make my own coffee and it's a lot cheaper and better than buying coffee. for me in Canada it's $2 to $6 for a cup of coffee, and it's environmentally bad for the environment, it's not fair trade and all the rest of it. So I have saved money, thousands of dollars a year, by not actually buying coffee. So I expect a lot of people, I said I wouldn't speculate, but I suspect a lot of people won't have the money to go back to the consumptive consumer lifestyle that they previously enjoyed. I don't know whether they enjoyed it or not, but I can't see them going back to that. So I think what we're going to see is a push for cheaper coffee rather than the expensive lattes. I think you're going to see a lot of leveling down for the vast majority of the population who don't control and own the wealth. For the very wealthy, things will continue much as before. At a certain point of activity, I might decide that travelling on public transport is actually safe to do without a mask. Though I'm going to be carrying an N95 and gloves with me and hand sanitizer with me for an awfully long time. I'm expecting to be carrying it for a year to 2 years. If I can self-isolate on the bus or the transit system, I will. If I'm in close proximity to people, I probably will put a mask on. And I probably will continue to do that for quite some time. Unlike most people, I will never forgive and I never forget. I'm not going to just forget this pandemic when it's open. The scenes that we saw were very human when the American state ridiculously opened up because of law, and everybody rushed to the bars without wearing face masks. I mean, good for them, you know. If they're prepared to risk catching COVID-19 disease from the person sitting next to them or the wait staff, that's good for them. I do feel sorry for the wait staff, but that's a whole different other issue. So for me, a partial reopening is going to be very, 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 very gradual, and it's only going to be based upon daily case infections, not deaths, in my local area. I won't be ever going on a cruise. I probably won't ever be travelling on a plane again unless I have a very good reason to travel on one. And if I do travel on a plane or a train, because I have good reason, I will use social distancing and or a face mask and gloves and carry my own sanitizer. I think this is not something I'm going to just let go back to normal. I don't want it to go back to normal. If it goes back to normal in my mind, I'm putting myself at risk. This is a clear and present danger. Everywhere around me I see sticky red jam, and I don't want to put it on my mouth or my nose or my eyes. Well, that's it for parts 1 and for parts 2. Stay tuned. When I get a chance, I'm working nights, I'm going to do part 3, which is when to come back into lockdown when you've partially or fully reopened. What are the signs and symptoms that you need to look for in your local community? What is the phased response that you need to be looking at in terms of making sure you do not get caught out? A large part of this will be looking at Spanish flu in 1918 and looking at the gaps between the peaks. You don't want to get caught out. The most dangerous time in a pandemic is when other people are not taking precautions. That's the beginning of the pandemic, February, March and to a degree April, when I was locked down and I was asking you guys to lock down. It's also the period of time now for the next few weeks to a month or more, whilst we wait to see. Nobody knows if we'll have a second wave and if the infection remains in the community. So I want to talk about infection spread in the community because the United States of America has research that no one else anywhere in the world has replicated in terms of community spread on this virus, and it'll be a long and it'll be involved and I hope fun video. Anyway, that's all from me. Remember, in SHTF, tomorrow will always be worse than today unless you prepare. And in a pandemic, tomorrow will always be worse than today, even if you prepare, until the peak really is over. Toodles. This has been a Hungry Terrier 2020 production.